Welcome to the Craftsman Online Podcast. This is a weekly program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, and back on our podcast this week, a returning guest, almost like a returning champion of sorts. Tonight, I do feel like it is a game of Jeopardy between the two of us as we're writing down our final answer. We welcome Brother John Nagy. Welcome back, Brother John.
Thanks you once again for having me, brother. This is number 9, the 9th episode.
It is.
And this will be closing out the year, as I understand it, the last one for you and I, at least.
Season number 1 is coming to a close, and you recognize Brother John as the voice of so many of our podcast episodes as part of the Building Better Builder series. Of course, he is a established Masonic author, and the book that we'll be talking about tonight is Building Free Men, Uncommonly Freeing Masonic Education. And that's going to lend to the conversation as we explore the deeper meaning of the word freeborn. And the inside joke that was happening here is John and I are both writing down what our secret meaning of that is in our envelope, and we'll reveal it at the end of the game show tonight. I always like to start with our first question. You are someone who's literally written a book on this subject. I like to be at the beginning of things. First time you heard the term freeborn as one of the necessary requirements to become a Mason, a man who's petitioning a lodge, what went through your head?
Oh my God. I remember I tried to make sense out of the word, and I did what every other ignorant, uninformed brother did. I went to freeborn. Well, born free. Oh, okay. That's me. I was born free. And that's exactly where I went when I first heard it. And of course, as I was instructed by other brothers about what the meaning was, they basically confirmed my conjecture with their own conjecture, because that's exactly what they were told. And I let it lay for quite a while, although I can tell you that I was very, very disturbed by what it is that I heard, because it meant that there was an exclusionary aspect to this word that was being used by many, many different brothers around, particularly the United States and the southern regions.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I was very disturbed by that. And I started doing some research just to kind of say, well, are there other meanings out there? Are there other definitions that I can stumble across to see what other people think? And I came across a few where individuals were saying, well, it's not really born free. It's more born with a free spirit, and they got into the esoteric, unfortunately chasing the unicorns around the North Pole kind of definitions with it. It gave me a little bit more comfort, but it didn't settle in very well, because there was something about it that was missing. I knew it in the core of my heart that something was missing. And it wasn't until years later when I started researching the word free in the statement free and accepted Mason and Freemason that I found the mother lode. But we'll get into that.
First, let's touch on the initial point that you made, which, yes, there is a common misconception to the meaning of the word freeborn across the craft. And you had touched on it. In America, I think a lot of our brothers think of it as, oh, they flip it around. Oh, I was born free. I was born in America. I'm a free person. I'm independent. There is also that historical context where you're like, oh, well, I wasn't born as a slave, so I'm freeborn. That means I can be a Mason. And those two positions are wrong, and for many reasons. And unfortunately, this can lead into an all-night almost conversation when you try to share this knowledge with another brother. How do you explain, and I don't want to say correct them, but how do you set this up to what the meaning of the word freeborn is there?
Well, if they're open and available to receiving light, I do share it. And I share with them immediately that there's two things that happen with this word freeborn that is a common characteristic of people who listen to it and try to make sense out of it. The very first thing that they do is they break the word apart. If it's presented as a compound word, literally freeborn, as opposed to free space born or free hyphen born, which you find in our archaic manuscripts, if they take it as a compound word, they split it apart, reassemble the order in which the words are stated, and then they use that as an assumption But they go one step further and they assume that the word free means in this phrase what free means today. And the fact of the matter is, the word free, when it comes to this particular word, doesn't mean unrestrained. It does not mean the typical meaning that is assigned to the word free. This word originated early on in the 13 and 1400s with manuscripts, the beginning of English, where the Normans were the aristocracy that was entrenched in England by the Normans was moving from 1300 to 1400 from French-speaking aristocracy to English. And it was at that point we had the beginnings of modern-day English. By 1400, it started entrenching itself. And the manuscripts, the Lansdowne manuscripts, I think it's 15 something or other, why we only see English up to maybe the beginnings of 13 to 1400 is because that's when modern English started its entrenchment. Prior to that, it was Middle English and early English, and you won't see the same spellings and pronunciation of words. So when we're looking for the beginnings of where was the first Freemason written down somewhere, well, you're not going to see it earlier than 1300 because that's the beginning of modern day English. So I started going back there and looking at it. And that's the information that I share with individuals who ask me about this word freeborn. I say, you can't break it apart and you can't rearrange it and assume that the words mean what it is that you're assigning to them. This is an archaic word and it has a specific meaning. And it was actually when you use it within the context of the earlier days, you start getting a very, very sharply focused conveyance within context. And therein lies the problem, is that we're using it, first of all, out of context, and we're using it with modern day assigned meanings, and it loses its intent. And so when we start looking at the qualifications of a Freemason, or shall I say a candidate coming through to become a Freemason, if you don't understand the words that are being spoken, you as a person who's supposed to be scrutinizing a candidate, welcoming them in, you're making a big mistake sometimes because you're assuming it means one thing and it means something utterly different.
As a New York Freemason, there is so much Old English that's already inherent in our ritual that I just figured it was an Old English word. I figured, oh, they forgot to include maybe the E at the end of freeborn, and we're supposed to pronounce it. I never questioned it until later when I started looking into the necessary requirements and turned to Google, and that's where I found many different definitions and possible meanings for the word. And this was one of the early rabbit holes that I stumbled into. I started doing a lodge presentation that talked about the 4 necessary requirements to be a Freemason, and being a man, that was a pretty easy check. Freeborn took me on a history lesson, which we'll share tonight, but I wanted to get your insight as to the meaning of freeborn as it relates to free and accepted Mason, because I've heard this before, and I want to hear your connection to it.
You have to first understand that the word free doesn't mean back then what it means today. If you look at all the different guilds that were going on back then, they existed with a precursor, either Franc or Franche, and their discipline, their vocation. So you might have Franc Mason, which is Freemason. In French, you have Franc fishermen, Franc or free fishmongers, blacksmiths, free tailors. You name the profession, they had the word free in front of it. So we know that every one of these professions, they weren't talking about freestones. So a freestone tailor, oh, let's take the stone out and call him free tailor, or freestone blacksmith. And, oh, we'll take the stone out and call him a free blacksmith. I have seen some very, very scholarly Masons way up in the chain, so to speak, use that as a reference point for why we are called Freemasons. And it's wrong. It's blatantly wrong. And it's something that's being shared in literature and in all sorts of lectures, and it's being propagated, and it's wrong.
So let's talk about what makes it right. Why is it right to use the term freeborn as it relates to one of the necessary requirements to become a Freemason?
And that's where I was getting at. This word free, when it's put in front of a profession, or when it's put in front of a word like born, you have to understand that the word free was a bastardization or Anglicanized version of franc and franche, which if you go back to the roots, there's one word in the English language that has kept the integrity of the original meaning, and that's frankincense. It literally means pure, superior, supreme incense. And when you understand that that is a holdover from an earlier time when the word captured franc, and understand that the word franc and franche, those precursors, when they were Anglicanized, we used the word free. And this all started around the 1300s when, again, the transition from the aristocracy from French to modern day English began. And they had a whole bunch of professions that were in and around the aristocracy, and they were all franc masons and franc, blacksmiths and tailors and what have you. And so they started calling them free masons and free blacksmiths and free tailors. And this word free indicated that they were the pure vocation or the superior vocation, or another way of saying it is they were the masters in that particular profession. And that's when I discovered that free and accepted literally meant, and I'm jumping to the end because there's a whole bunch of stuff I could add to this, but free and accepted literally means master and apprentice masons. And so when you have free and accepted masons, it's not operative and speculative like is so often shared. It's master and apprentice. So when I looked at this superior, pure, whatever that was assigned to this word free, I started looking at freeborn and saying, I wonder, could it be that simple? And so what I did was I did what I normally do. I started looking at the earliest versions of this being used within our profession, or shall I say our society. And I found that the earliest manuscript that I could get a hold of had something along the lines of that an apprentice had to be able of birth. And the very next manuscript that I got a hold, which was a few years later, I think it was the Lansdale, if I'm not mistaken, they go to explain what this able of birth meant. So it says the apprentice had to be able of birth, and it adds the following phrase, that is to say, freeborn with all limbs available.
Right.
And I said to myself, wow, here you have a document that is absolutely capturing the word freeborn in context and saying, that is to say, freeborn. So I started looking up the term able of birth, and it basically means suitable from the very beginning or superior stock. And what's really neat is when you look at the manuscripts, what they were trying to convey is you bring any apprentice on board that by the very beginning, you can tell that they have what it takes to complete what is necessary to become a fellowcraft, which at the time a fellowcraft was a master mason, which is a whole different story that we can get into, but they screwed up in the Grand Lodge era by separating them out.
No screw ups.
Yes, they did.
Never.
And it was an innovation. We won't go in there. That's another interview.
Save that one for season 2.
If you bring in an apprentice, you have to make sure that they qualify. And the best way to qualify them is to say, do they show all the signs of being able to be shaped into a fellowcraft mason? If they show any lackings, you can't bring them on board because it's a 7-year process. And with the 7 years that you as a master are going to invest in this basically prepubescent kid, that if they show signs of being an idiot or some of their limbs are missing, I mean, they're already hampered and they're already showing that they may not be able to do what's necessary to become the very thing that the master is trying to bring about. So when it says able of birth means suitable from the very beginning. And the way I always phrase it is that they were superior stock. They were the stock that you would be able to grab a hold of. There was no flaws within the character of this apprentice that would prevent them from becoming a masterful mason. And so many brothers don't get it. And if you look at the original manuscripts, it also goes on to say all limbs intact and not a bondsman. Now, it's like, okay, so many people say a bondsman is a slave. A bondsman is not a slave. A bondsman is a person who is obligated by their birth to take over the land or take over the business of the father. It's usually the firstborn, unless the firstborn says, no, I don't want that. You can have it secondborn. But if you're a firstborn and you do not say no to your heritage, then you are a bondsman, an AKA husband, bound to the house or the home. And,
Yeah.
So they're saying the apprentices, basically, if they are a firstborn male child, they're a bondsman. Unless they say, no, I'll turn over that heritage to the second one in line and let them take it, then they're no longer a bondsman. But they had to make sure that they took the obligation of their bond with the property or the vocation serious. So in our manuscripts early on in the Stonecraft Operative Guild or operative manuscripts, it says suitable of birth, or shall I say able of birth. That is to say, freeborn, all limbs intact, and I'll put in not an idiot. And of course, not a bondsman, which has nothing to do with slave. It has to do with an obligation of family heritage that has to be honored in one way or form. It's literally the firstborn's obligation to make sure that the property and the vocation that the father has is taken care of. And if they can't take care of it, they turn it over to the next in line. And now here's the kicker. And this is what a lot of Masons don't understand when they start putting this not born a slave back in front of everybody. And trust me, I have had my fair share of people way up the chain pointing to freeborn and saying, because of that. And then they go off into Zootland trying to explain their prejudice. It's real simple. Brother, I'm going to ask you a question. How old do you think apprentices were, roughly, when they entered into apprenticeship?
Back in the day, from what I heard, wasn't it like 10, 12, like very young?
7 or 8. And the reason why they put them into apprenticeship, because at that particular age, they started socializing and getting into trouble. So what they did was they moved them out of the house they were born in into the hands of somebody else who wouldn't take any of their BS. Right. Now, so we're both clear. BS is bogus specifics. So let's keep it clean. And you know very well that as kids grow up and they get into that age, they start venturing and getting into all sorts of trouble. So what happens is they had a beautiful way of handling that next generation coming up. They shipped them off to somebody who wouldn't take it, and they put them indentured for 7 years. Yeah. So they moved from basically 7 years old all the way up till around 14, 15 years old, depending on how, and they served 7 years. And when I say 7 years, they served until their servitude was complete. Now, why did I say servitude? Because first and foremost, these 7 and 8 year old kids, they were property. What is property? They were slaves to their guardian, whether it be their father or mother or a guardian, make no difference. These apprentices were coming in as slaves.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm going to go one step further. And they came in and they became indentured servants until they served their time and learned the trade. So when people start throwing this, oh, you can't be born a slave, and you don't get it. Apprentices in the operative guilds, they were property, and the ownership of the property was handed from the parents or guardian over to the master, and the master ruled. Mm-hmm. And the master was their master, literally master, because they were property. So the insane argument about, oh, you can't be born a slave. Good God, don't you know your history? These apprentices were slaves coming in, every last one of them.
I've heard this explanation, and that the concept of freeborn was that you weren't obligated to serve someone else or under someone else, which fits into the entered apprentice. For those of, many of us don't work in the trades anymore, but if you meet a brother who's an electrician, he will be an apprentice for a number of years, and you'll get two versions of the conversation, one that he can have publicly with you, and then one that'll be off to the side. It'll be a little bit more colorful as to some of the things that they go through as apprentices, but it's part of that learning process, and it's just been one of the few things that has not survived over the years, but in Freemasonry it exists. And it is interesting because I knew that we were going to come to similar conclusions, but have separate answers to this as to the research of the word freeborn and how that relates to Masonry. Where mine is going to be coming from is with the unicorns around the campfire. It's a little bit more esoteric, but My research took me into exploring the work and the lives of John Lilburn, who's basically the author of Freeborn Rights, and then John Locke, who you may recognize as the person who came up with the idea of life, liberty, and quote-unquote the pursuit of happiness. One man lived during the Age of Reason, the other lived during the Age of Enlightenment. Summarizing their lives, you would say that they both believed in this idea of liberty. This was because there were ruling classes, and these men believed that no man, no king should be able to tell you as a man what you can and can't do. You can see where the basis of liberty and where, that would have a very American appeal to it as a country that values our independence. And when I stumbled across that, I thought, this is really what the term freeborn is, just as you're saying, is that you're not obligated to serve under anybody else, that you're being a man, that you're making this decision of your own. And it is a question that is also asked several times throughout the process, but this is a decision that you are making. And not only are you making it, but that you are allowed, you are empowered to make this decision. And I think that that's something that also goes right over a lot of brothers' heads, is that there are men, sadly, still in this world today who cannot make these decisions for themselves. They want to, but they don't have the power to act. To me, that concept of being freeborn, and as you described it, of a superior stock, so to speak, if that doesn't put a smile on your face to make you think that there is a benefit of being a Freemason, in that you come from a place to where we're not saying you are perfect, but it could be morally, it could be physically, it could be a combination of the both, that as a specimen, you have the ability to achieve more, and you can get there through the lessons in the craft.
I am very troubled when I hear the word perfect thrown in, when I clearly understand within the context of what's being said that the individual means flawed. And the fact of the matter is, perfect has two entirely different, diametrically different meanings. One is having to do with being flawless, and the other one has to do with being mature, suitable. And it is assumed when an apprentice comes in that they are immature. It is assumed that they are someone who has to be matured, and moving them from youth to adulthood, literally going from the first step to the second step and preparing in that second step for age. So we have a symbolic lodge, and we have so many people who are on the front lines or dictating what the frontline workers ought to be doing. And they're interpreting this word freeborn to mean not born a slave. And if they're silly enough to go to a common usage dictionary, they're going to get that reinforced. They're not going to be educated, though, in the ways of the craft. Correct. We don't have 7-year-old, 8-year-old boys coming into our fraternity. We have 18-year-old in certain jurisdictions, but we have basically 21-year-old men, or shall I say biologically adult men, who have all the legal responsibilities of a society. They come in, and we're basically symbolically calling them youth and immature or imperfect. And how can you use this word freeborn with a man who comes in, has literally got a wallet, has got a job, has got a bank account, got a car paid for, got a family, and we're looking at it, well, you're not freeborn, as in you're not born a slave. And come on, it's a symbolic lodge, man. All this is supposed to be symbolic. Are they capable of learning ritual? Are they capable of understanding ritual? Are they capable of performing ritual? If you're looking at them from their heritages and their social background, and you're saying, well, that person might have come from a slave background. Well, Michael, my heritage is Slavic. You know what the word slave comes from? Slav.
Yeah.
Right? My background, my literal heritage is we were the originators of the word slave. And it's like, all right, so because people in my background were slaves or Slavs, therefore John would never become a Mason, because obviously he's got slave blood in him somewhere from someone in his background. And it's like, you just don't get it.
Right.
We have so many people around the world that have this kind of background, in their bloodline and their background, and to bring it into modern day context. Has there been a slave born in America since when? 18 what? 65? You know, it's nonsense. Not only is it nonsense, it's not backed up by history. And when we finally do look at what the word actually does mean, we have to ascertain whether the person is capable mentally and physically of understanding, comprehending, and performing ritual. If they can, they're perfect stock. Why? Because we've got to basically replace the last generation who's been doing it with a new generation to keep the ritual alive. And there's no excuses.
And I love that, again, we're kind of marrying that word freeborn, where you gave the historical breakdown definition of it. And in the larger sense, through the research that I did, these were men who came with the idea that fed the revolutionaries of, what we look back to as our famous American Masons, that came up with these ideas, that took these working tools and made them symbolic representations and injected all of this age of enlightenment wisdom into a common gavel to make it mean something more, but yet it's a simple tool that you can hold in your hand, or a square and compass that you can have on your ring with the letter G or without, which serves as that reminder to the greater principles. And to me, that's what makes, Freemasonry special. And when we talk about someone who's freeborn, yes, you're absolutely right. We want to make sure that the people that we're bringing in to share this knowledge with, that they have the ability to understand that, to comprehend that, and it has a meaning to them.
If a person is suitable stock, they meet the qualification. What is suitable stock? Can they eventually learn the ritual, understand it, and perform it? And very little emphasis on understanding. If they can just basically learn it and perform it, the understanding becomes secondary, because a lot of people don't understand it. A lot of members have no comprehension of what any of these words mean. In particularly many jurisdictions, you're required to memorize what is called a proficiency, which is in the form of a catechism. And I have seen a lot of men who struggle with the memorization work, and if they fail that, they weren't suitable, but it becomes an embarrassment. And I know of quite a few brothers that were brought in that couldn't do the memorization work, and they didn't get past the apprentice level, and they should have not been allowed to petition and cause that kind of embarrassment.
Right.
They weren't freeborn.
In a modern context, when I look at the term freeborn, I always have this conversation with interested gentlemen who want to join Freemasonry, is there's going to be two things that are going to be asked of you to become a member of this lodge, and it's time and it's money. And you're going to have to pay dues at some point. And then the second thing is that it's also going to be a requirement of your time, and that this isn't like joining a bowling league or any other social club that's out there. Well, those are all good. Freemasonry is a little bit different, especially in the beginning, where there's going to be some learning that's required of you, this proficiency that we've talked about. And I try to set that expectation, because to me, that is a good determining factor to find if somebody really is freeborn or up to that task of yet which they do not know what it is. As we get ready to close out this episode, I really wanted to get back to the basis of the word freeborn. And I've been thinking a lot about this. And do you think that being freeborn is a possible hidden virtue that exists in Masons?
I'd have to say absolutely. There are two virtues that are very rarely discussed as an entry requirement for Masons, and I think this would be an excellent time to broach both of them. The first one is piety, which is the fifth virtue that Plato had talked about. He mentioned the cardinal virtues, but he also said piety is another virtue that is a requirement. And the modern day version, or the word that best captures piety today, is reverence. And if a person doesn't have reverence, they really do not make a good Mason. The second one is freeborn. If they are suitable stock, if they're capable of doing the work that is going to be in front of them as an apprentice, as a fellow craft and master Mason, then they are somebody to consider. But if they can't do the basics, memorization work, repeat back, just simple things that allow you to participate in the craft and make you part of the whole. You don't have the strength to pull it off. And virtue is all about strength. And if you don't have the ability to memorize and be able to learn what needs to be learned, you're going to be severely challenged because you're not strong enough. And yes, I'd say it is a virtue.
Kind of makes me sad, as we talked about in the beginning, that this is our last episode for the first season of the Craftsman Online podcast. But, and I say but, you will hear Brother Nagy in season 2. We will have him back as a reoccurring and repeating champion/guest. But in the coming weeks, I have a suspicion that you're going to be featured during our top 10 countdown of the most listened to podcast episodes this season for Craftsman Online. So start thinking back on the great inventory of topics that we have discussed and think back to which ones meant the most to you, and join us starting, next week when this episode airs, and the following week we'll start our countdown, and we'll see where Brother John lands. Until then, you have yourself a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Likewise to you, Brother Michael. Thank you once again for having me on these wonderful 9 episodes. And I am really, truly looking forward to what's in store for next year. May your holidays be merry and bright. May your Christmas be filled with a lot of gifts coming and going. And your new year bring to you great health and great expectation as what to come.
Thank you, my brother. And thank you for listening to the Craftsman Online podcast. If Masonic education is important to you, you can visit us at craftsmanonline.com. A reminder, new episodes will be available for download starting Monday, January 10th. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.